Official reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic has varied from country to country. Sweden took a different path than many, making policy that called on the mutual trust and responsibility of its citizens to contain the virus. How's that going? Well, let's find out. With us now for more on the so-called Swedish approach. In Stockholm, Sweden, there's Lars Trägårdh. He is a professor of history and civil society studies at Ersta Sköndal University College. And it's so delightful to have you on our program tonight. How are you doing, Professor?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you are managing. Let me share these numbers with you and our viewers. As we look at, and these numbers are as of last night, Sunday night, as we look at COVID-19 fatalities per million citizens, if we look at the Scandinavian countries, Finland is at 34, Norway at 37, Denmark almost twice as high at 73, but then look at Sweden, 217. Just by way of comparison, Canada is at about 68. The much higher rate of COVID-19 fatalities is generally seen as a kind of a failure of Sweden's policy of nudging rather than ordering people to adhere to stronger protocols. How do you think the Swedish people regard this experience?
Well, I suppose in a way that would be surprising to a lot of foreign observers, because I think the way you present the numbers, one would conclude that that's pretty much not a disaster perhaps, but it's certainly are negative numbers from that particular metric, which is an important metric. People dying, of course we care about that. But I would say that in general the support here is very strong for the Swedish policy. The Social Democratic government is doing very well in terms of trust and confidence. Their numbers have shot up, if anything. Now that's of course true everywhere. There's a rallying around the flag that we see in general. So there's a lot of support here. And some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that it is based on trust. There is a calmness in Swedish society. There is not perhaps the same degree of fear or worry that we see in a lot of other countries. Now, you may argue, of course, that that's a false sense of security, given the numbers that you just pointed to. And there is an internal debate also in Sweden. We have to remember that the fatalities are concentrated, unfortunately, and very sadly, I think that's true in Canada as well, in the elderly population, particularly those in institutions. We also have, and this I think is a very important issue that we'll see debated a lot, in months to come, a large group that are immigrant communities in suburb areas, particularly of Stockholm. And there we have a connection, because many of them actually work also in these institutions for the elderly. And here you have a mismatch also in terms of communication, language, perhaps even cultural conflicts. So there are several factors here, but I think it's a paradoxical situation. There's a lot of support for Swedish policies. Perhaps we can talk more about why. But there's also, of course, a very open debate about what we here, quite frankly, see as colossal failures when it comes to protecting the elderly, and this quite shameful discrepancy between what happens in our immigrant communities versus what happens in more wealthier parts of Sweden with middle-class ethnic Swedes.
Lots to unpack there, so let's start to do that now. What have you in Sweden been able to do over the last 5 or 6 weeks that, say, those of us in the rest of the world, or particularly in Canada, have not been able to do?
Now, that I think is an excellent question. One of the problems I think in this kind of, I think, rather inflamed, exaggerated debate about Swedish difference is that it often becomes a sort of two empty categories. It's either lockdown or it's lax, which would be Sweden, right? But in reality, if you live like I do in Stockholm, the differences are not that vast. In fact, we are also practicing social distance. The fact that it's done on a more voluntary basis doesn't mean it's real. We do that to a very, very great extent. Swedes are part of the trust aspect is that people are actually trying to follow the recommendations that are not just simply kind of vague advice, but they are fairly strong recommendations. So, in the reality of life here, people are working at home, they're used in distance. As far as teaching is concerned, university level, at the high school levels is all due through distance. So the differences are specific and interesting. One is schools, right? This is a very important difference. So preschool and primary school in Sweden are open. And there's a very wide support for that. We can get back to why that is, has to do with certain cultural differences. Then it is also true that we have shops and restaurants open to a greater extent, I think, perhaps than is a common, in some countries. I mean, there's a lot of variation also here from country to country. But there is very many rules in place for how to behave in these situations. So one of the most important thing is you don't want to exaggerate the difference. It's not like Sweden is going through some sort of one big after-ski party where just partying, having a good time, hugging and kissing left and right. I mean, that's just not what's going on here on the streets of Stockholm.
What would it be about the Swedish character or about the Swedish tradition that would say, yes, we have confidence in our government's handling of things, despite the fact that our rate of death is significantly higher than all of our neighbors?
Well, I mean, there is, of course, a lot more aspects going on here. People are thinking about both longer term and shorter term. And we have also endowed our health authorities with a broader responsibility so that, we also have to think about what happened to the young people in Sweden, not only to people who are getting sick and dying. So, for example, if you take the school issue, right, this is a very important question because it concerns, right, the future of children. And everybody understands that the school is absolutely crucial here. And in Sweden, issues like children's rights, as well as gender equality, are very, very definitive, if you will, to the social contract as such. So you try to balance different types of priorities here. That's having said that, I don't think anybody had wished, for the amount of deaths that we've seen, particularly then among the elderly. But we have to recognize that here, is an understanding that there is a kind of a broad job that the government and the health authorities have before them. And even if in service that's been done with the elderly, they tend to answer that they think that the government has a reasonably good balance here in terms of keeping society functioning, keeping it open on the one hand, and trying to care as much as possible, make sure the healthcare system does not break down. And we have to remember here that the healthcare system is not breaking down in Sweden. We don't have a situation of panic or chaos or anything approaching that at this point.
Now, I gather a few weeks ago there was a group of 20 or so, 22 health scientists who quite publicly dissented with the current government's approach to all this. What impact has that had?
Not that much. The problem here is that there has been a certain amount of, let's say, I would maybe not call it disinformation, but cherry picking in international media. That particular article you referred to was full of errors. It received a lot of criticism in Sweden itself. And so it's a good example of, how, media reporting, partly because we're not traveling anymore. So people are living in a world of internet. And unfortunately, you don't get the very full picture, right, from, consulting only media through the internet. So that article is a good example, right, of a piece of writing that may have gotten feet, in the international media world, but in Sweden itself, it was a article that by and large was dismissed because of factual errors and so forth.
But I gather, generally speaking, and I'm going to simplify this probably too much here, but generally speaking, the government came to the conclusion that the people of Sweden were simply unwilling to put up with much sharper restrictions than, say, we in Canada have put up with for the last 5 or 6 weeks for an extended period of time. Why would they have come to that conclusion?
Well, we see it now, I think, very clearly also in the United States, throughout Europe. We see a lot of people who say enough is enough, right? The question is, how long is it sustainable to have more extreme versions of a lockdown, right? So the Swedish government, yes, and the health authorities have been betting on something that is more sustainable. So we don't have a discussion in Sweden right now about opening up. We don't have a discussion like you have in Denmark or Norway about opening up schools. How is that going to work? Are you going to have now increasing rates of infection and so forth, right? So we've chosen strategically a different way of doing it. And we'll see, of course, in months, maybe in a year from now, we'll see better how that has worked out. But sustainability is a key factor here in Sweden. I'm glad you bring that up, because I think that's something that we all have to deal with throughout the world at this point. How are we going to have a sustainable relationship to the coronavirus?
Sure, but the notion to, or the idea to keep the schools open during this time, can you tell whether or not that has resulted in a lot of students contracting the virus, bringing it home, giving it to their parents and grandparents? Has it had that impact?
And not from what we can see. And now there are new studies coming out. There was just a new study coming out from Iceland, and there's yet another study I heard about just the other day that does seem to suggest, right, that children, particularly younger children from, let's say 10 and younger, do not actually contract it or spread it. So we have seen very, very little indications of that. The problem really has been, as I said earlier, among the elderly. So there's very little indications, and there's no real concern over the schools, the primary schools and the preschools in Sweden, I would say.
Professor, do you think the Swedish government simply made a hard calculation that the risk to the country's economic prosperity was greater than the potential risk to the population, and therefore they chose the path they chose?
I don't think so. I don't think it was in terms of economy versus health of people. I think it was a broader concern about the social fabric in general. That's, for example, why I brought up the question of the school. That was much more important. You have to remember that Sweden is extremely hard hit economically as well. I mean, there's no question. I mean, you see the debate here now. It's like in other countries, all about, are we going to survive economically over the long term? So I don't think that was the trade-off, the central trade-off. The central trade-off had more to do with the broader questions about different parts of society that needs to be hang together. I think that Swedes don't want to privatize the how you deal with a virus like this. Closing schools is one way of doing that. Then you sort of say, everybody go home, lock yourselves up in your apartments. That is the way we chose not to do it here. And of course we can argue about that. I mean, I can absolutely see why one would arrive at different conclusions around these issues. And there's something here I think want to mention too. Is something very unlikely about the Swedish approach. If we go back to the AIDS crisis, the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, compare Sweden and Denmark, it was the reverse. Sweden was by far the most draconian of the societies. Same thing with the cholera epidemic, late 19th century. So there's something also very unlikely about Sweden being sort of the liberal guys right now, and the Danes, being tougher, historically speaking. So there's a lot for us researchers to try to understand when we're going to analyze this in years to come.
In our last minute here, I do want to ask you a bit of a personal question, which is, yes, you're living in Sweden now, but you did live for a number of decades in the United States. So I wonder, where would you rather be riding out this pandemic? Where you are or where you were?
Here, without any question.
How come?
And this is a funny thing. I mean, you ask people here, I know quite a few Americans here as well. And of course, we can all be critical of it and so forth. But boy, I tell you, it is wonderful that we have retained the amount of freedoms that we have here. And I'm flabbergasted now to see that in the US, the people who are sort of speaking well about Sweden are sort of the libertarian right. Go figure. Who would have thought, that Swedish social democracy would be in bed with American right-wing libertarians?
Not me. Well done. Okay, Lars Trägårdh, the historian from Ersta Sköndal University College in Stockholm. It's really good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.